bring it up. Bring it up I don't think it has to be a motion, we just say, hey, here's how we're gonna do the agenda.
Motion to amend the agenda.
We're ready, Mike.
All right, go ahead and call this meeting of the Development Committee to order. Stand for the pledge, please.
I don't think
I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Kathy, you can go ahead and call the roll, please.
Powell,
Here.
Carter. Here. Walter.
Here. All right, got a few things on the agenda tonight. The first is we're gonna talk about impact fees and the impact fee program proposal. We have Jim Leonard from Burton Planning Services. Scott, I'm hand over to you, introduce him.
Sure, this is Jim Leonard with Burton Planning Services, and I'll turn it over to BJ in a second. We did receive a copy of the proposal that's included in your packet for Development Committee. So while, as Mr. Leonard speaks, if you want to reference that, feel free.
Typically, whenever we have somebody address the committee, there has to be a motion passed permitting them to address the committee, so I recommend doing that.
Okay. I'll entertain a motion to allow Mr. Leonard to address the Development Committee.
So moved.
Second.
Kathy?
Powell.
Yes.
Carter. Yes. Walter.
Yes.
Scott, can I ask you, is this the same proposal that was emailed to us? Or has it
Yes, I
changed?
It
believe
is.
so.
Same
It is the
proposal.
same, so nothing's different?
Yep,
Okay.
same one.
Take it away, Jim.
It's weird being on this side.
Good afternoon, evening, sorry. My name is Jim Leonard. I work with Burton Planning Services as their Community and Economic Development Director. I met with the city staff, city engineer actually reached out to us regarding our ability to complete this proposal as presented to you folks. And I'm here to answer any questions. Mr. King asked me to stop by if there's any questions from you folks. Basically, what we're gonna look at is the city's needs based on infrastructure, including the capital improvements plan, your financing structure, indebtedness, and then your future land use map, and come up with a formula in which the city then can use to levy against future developments in the future to help offset those costs of those improvements. Our general idea in just working this through is having some zones set up throughout the city, that if money is generated in that zone, that it should stay in that zone for improvements. So that's kind of the idea we're going down, but obviously working with the city staff and council to your liking of what you actually want. But I don't know, BJ, if there's any specifics you want me to hit?
Just on the zone issue again, when we met, we talked about that because there's been some discussion about impact fees being localized right where a subdivision is going in, essentially saying if it's going on Broad, we're gonna look at doing impact fees to improve Broad.
Sure.
What we talked about doing is drafting them as such that the zone where the development is located in, the impact fees from that could be used for improvements anywhere in that zone, is that
Correct.
correct? Okay.
Yeah, so what you want to avoid is, say Broad is okay, but an impact is on Broad. The city could look one or two intersections further and see if that's a better and wiser use of those funds, not just hamstringing the city to one exact intersection or one exact improvement. You'll have a buffet list of items in that zone that should be completed.
The zone, how would we determine what that is? I mean, is it a radius of an area or miles or, how would we
It
determine
wouldn't
what
be,
the zone is?
we would essentially quadrants, break the city up into quadrants. And, just as an example, we were talking, using the wards makes sense. And I know we talked about that. There are some roads that wards straddle. So it may not make sense to do it that way, but doing it in, creating essentially quadrants areas in the city, we could make them as large as we wanted to or as small as we wanted to. And I suggest making them larger because I think we would have a benefit then there's better chance for improvements using those fees. But we'd certainly target those.
Yeah, and we can entertain the ward system as it's set up, or propose different sections based on, you know, major collectors, the buffer or the radius that we would evaluate that as well. Not a problem.
I've got a ton of questions.
Me too, so
But
we'll
no,
just-
go.
we'll go back and forth. on that.
Okay, so if you don't mind me just kind of starting here.
Sure.
What of those cities have you worked in where this is something you've helped to implement?
None. I've done it on my own through other communities of researching it, but never have I actually, me personally, been involved with the implementation of this plan.
Okay. Okay, with the research that you've done,
Sure.
what's your barometer for success in this? What would you call success? If this was implemented in Pataskala, what would be the success of this fee?
First and foremost, adoption by council, because often you see these things that are
I'm sorry, let's assume it's
Sure.
adopted by
Okay.
council, and then we implement it, and developers have to pay this. What is the success? What,
less burden to the taxpayers that would typically have to front the money for these improvements. I mean, so if, you know, typically you would have to borrow money to, and, you know, improve an intersection or do something, you would help offset that or underwrite loans based on the impact fees that are collected by the city.
okay.
I mean, there's many different,
I think, like, if this was implemented, 5 years down the road, you were to look back at it and say if it was a success or a failure, how would you measure that? Is that kind of what you're trying to say?
I'm trying to say that, and I'm gonna, because it leads to another question that I have about this. But yeah, that's where I'm going with that, is what is your barometer of success? I know that you're gonna collect money, you're gonna be able to pay for some things, that's very good. But as far as the city growth and the benefit to the city in general, how have you measured that? Or what have you seen in communities that have input this? Let's just use Pickerington as an example. What have they seen as a success because of impact fees?
what have they seen? I can't speak specifically to Pickerington. I mean, anecdotally, you have better roadway system, less strain on the city finances that are out of pocket. You know, development pays for itself or comes close to paying for itself. It doesn't truly pay for itself, but you'll have various metrics, and we can obviously work for the city or work with the city to lay out those metrics that in 5 years we need to reevaluate this. And as you should with any plan, is a 5-year look back and say, hey, yeah, this was a mistake, this was good. So I honestly would default back to the city and what do you want out of that? What are your goals? What are your priorities to look back in 5 years and say, Jim, you really messed this up. This isn't what we wanted, or, you know, this was spot on. I mean, I'm here to put all the information together and regurgitate back out a formula, a program. But what it is successful for and what we're gonna use it for, what you're gonna use it for is completely and entirely up to you guys.
And my question is kind of the same as what Andy is asking, only I guess more specifically, I would want to know, in past practice, what is the take of a developer when they are looking at a city that has impact fees? Is it something that discourages them or that they're accustomed to? I think that's where I would gauge the success.
That's
'Cause
exactly that was my follow-up was,
Yeah.
what's the trade-off?
Because I'm trying to see, obviously, on this side of it, because this is the only side we're working from, I
Sure.
see success. I mean, anytime that we're getting extra money in to make infrastructure improvements is a win for us and our taxpayers.
Sure.
However, how much of a win are we gonna get depending on how the developer looks at it?
So, yeah, so many developers will give you different opinions, but I mean, there's drawbacks. So let's say we come up with a $4,000 impact fee, whatever it is. Who's paying that? The homeowner. Increased housing costs, good or bad, depending on what side, where you're at with housing costs that are in the central Ohio region. So some would welcome the impact fee and say, hey, we are gonna impact intersection A. We need to pay our fair share. Some would say, well, we're giving our application fees, you're gonna get income tax from these people, we shouldn't have to be paying for infrastructure that's 2 blocks away, we're not gonna impact it. So there's pluses and minuses, obviously. But I think your job, my job, is to help you make a decision for the best interest of the city and to help offset those takes from a developer, per se. when they're taking capacity away from your intersections and downgrading them, I think it's a win for the city. But there are, I'll be honest, absolutely, there's gonna be some developers that are gonna say, oh my, I don't wanna pay that $4,000 in Patasko, we're gonna go look at Reynoldsburg, or something like that, absolutely. I mean, those are same thing with, water and sewer taps, you know, how are those affected by your potential developers as well? I don't know if I'm answering your question. but we're trying-
Absolutely.
How do you determine impact? The amount of impact that a development has on a certain area?
So, in this instance, what we would do is take a look at, work with the city engineer and your administration, look at all your needs from roadway infrastructure. We're only looking at roadway, by the way, nothing with parks like Pickerington, smorgasbord of things. Look at your roadway needs, look at the future development, and how do we, future development as in units, how do we take the needs of the city, which is the CIP and your financing structure, and divvy that up amongst the future land use, the future uses that are gonna be coming to the city. So you almost divide your cost by your potential units, and that's very simplistic, but you would then come up with a fee of impact. It's roadway impact, so we're not gonna look at water. If an intersection needs a 12-inch water main and there's only an 8, this doesn't take into account, it's purely the intersection, it's purely the turn lanes, it's the infrastructure. So when you say impact, when I say impact, it's roadway, intersection, traveling public impact.
Andy?
So some of the things that I kind of see in this, and I want to see if you agree or not, but
Sure.
obviously, if you have impact fees assessed against a developer, the existing landowner is gonna receive less money. If everything is equal, they're gonna receive less money for their acreage that they're gonna buy. Is that something that
Potentially,
is a
sure.
factor? And the second one would be that it would slow development, because as you said, some will go other places and not develop necessarily in Pataskala. You know, the other one that I have is this, in my mind at least, obviously the end user is gonna pay a higher price for the same house that maybe just down the road was built 5 years earlier without impact fees, which is now at X minus that impact fee.
Right.
So you've got this immediate effect to every house that's existing, brings them up in price. Or every house that you build new devalues immediately that impact fee, one way or the other. It has to work that way.
Sure.
On supply and demand. That's how I see the trade-offs on this. And I'm trying to figure out, and I think this goes to Mike's question, you know, our typical tools of assessing impact fee, or impacts, not fees, but is a traffic study. It's, you know, the determination on whether or not, you know, some level of appropriateness for an intersection is met or not.
Right.
We don't really have any other tools to do this, so I'm kind of still interested in how do you determine a 200 unit subdivision impacts versus a 600 condo unit impact, when the acreage may be completely different, the square footage is completely different, totally different part of the city. I'm just, that's what I'm trying to understand how you can put that. I'm an engineer, so I have to have a mathematical equation to make this work.
Yeah, and it would be, we talked about having different impact fees for different sections with the staff.
Okay.
It gets really convoluted, really robust in terms of the program that the proposal that I've prepared for you all gets very detailed. So what we kind of parlayed back was, okay, let's look at the entirety of the city, and in the end, it would be a per unit basis would be the fee. So when
you say, I'm sorry, when you say per unit, do you mean different classifications of units? Per condo, per apartment, per single family dwelling? Is that the unit that you're talking about?
correct.
Okay.
Yeah, so a single family on the east side is gonna pay the same as the single family on the west side. So, because you could make an argument the single family on the east side is different than the west side because the impacts are different, but talk about I mean, it's possible, absolutely it's possible.
I'm not asking to make this tough.
But-
I'm just trying to understand how we are gonna go, if we go down this path,
Yep,
how we would go down that path. Obviously, as you said, success is implementation, right?
Sure.
In the idea of you're gonna put some hard work and time and this city's gonna pay for it.
Yep.
And if we decide not to implement it, then it's unsuccessful, period. So I'm just trying to understand, before we get into that determination of if we're gonna implement or not, how are we gonna come to those fees, in general, and is it fair, in essence, in my mind?
Sure.
Okay, so mine, I have a little more, cause I work different than Andy. I need the whole picture real quick.
Sure.
So when we're looking at putting the plan together, what would be the timeframe? And how would we go about it? I mean, when can we expect it to be completed, and what do we have to do in the meantime to put it together? Would you work solely with the staff, city staff, or does that include, members of council, which I think is necessary? Maybe some feedback from members of our, city, some residents, and maybe business owners. I mean, I think that it would impact various areas, you know, that would need to have some input. So, and maybe I'm overthinking it, but I'm trying to just get a picture of how we would put it together. I guess I can go to the comp plan and how we went about that. Hopefully it's a little easier than the comp plan.
I'm not sure, well, I'm not sure about the comp plan, but I hope it's easier just based on your tone, so. So what the proposal was slated for was working with the city staff, and then a development committee meeting, and then a presentation to council, so it would be there at that. But if there's a different way about you want to pull it off, I'm open to that too. We can look at that and amend what we need to in terms of meetings, with myself and you guys, or we're open to. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I need to work with you guys, so what you guys want is what you will get from
Well, I guess
us.
that's where, for us, this is new.
Sure.
So that's where that guidance is necessary. I mean, obviously, our administration would lead the project.
Sure.
But ultimately, it would make sense to involve council in it as well. That way, when it got to us, it wouldn't get bounced back and forth. I'm looking for the quickest path to completion is how I'm trying to frame it. So those were, and what the possibility is of ending up over the end cost that was proposed. I mean, is that based on the time that it takes? Or if we add additional variables, what would kick that cost up?
Yeah, so, variables could be, you know, Jim, we need you to come to the next 5 development committee meetings or something like that. Cause we only put in here, it's based on hourly, what we believe it will take to do the work. So, you know, if there's an extra meeting or something, it's not gonna jump the price. I mean, we're not gonna do that to you, but if it becomes a repetitive task of Jim, okay, we want our zones changed and you need to do this, there'll be some of that in the very beginning, but if it's put together and presented and there's public comment and there's this back and forth, and obviously I gotta go back to my boss and tell her that, and she's
There
gonna
should be a
ask me.
cushion put in there, because we're kind of high maintenance, so there
I mean,
should be some anticipation of
I think in the,
extra.
I think in the very bottom, it's just an hourly rate of 125 if we go above and beyond what
Okay.
is here, unless you need to amend the scope, then we can, but,
Okay.
again, if it's an hour or 3, you're not gonna see an invoice from us. But if it gets in depth and we're digging into it a little bit more based on your requirements, not us doing something incorrectly that you want, you know, if, not that I'm saying that will happen, but if you tell us X and we give you Y, you're not paying for that.
Another 2 more questions. First one would be, I'm sure you're aware we have a city water and we have a water district that is completely separate. I saw in the proposal how you were looking at impacts towards water. You just mentioned that this was only impact toward roadway.
Yes.
So in the scope, I thought you had
Oh, yeah.
mentioned some other utilities that you were gonna look at for impacts.
No, I thought I took that out. Do you know where it was, Butch?
I just glanced at it here. I can tell you in a moment, but can I ask my second question?
Sure.
The second one is, when you talk about impacts, and you're talking about units, I think of impacts for other things, such as, there are impacts that churches cause, there are impacts that schools cause, there's impacts that a recreational, and I think of a large, recreational park, like a soccer park.
Yeah.
That
Bellflower Park or
bring in, you know, select teams, and they
Sure.
have a whole weekend there, every weekend. How do you handle those in this?
Right. So well, that'll be a policy decision by the city. I mean, we can look at nonprofits or the church, the faith-based organizations, and that could be a decision by council, by the city of saying, no way, they're not being charged, or it could be by a per pupil basis or something like that. It could be programmed in this plan of how we collectively, the city and our team would look at that, but
Okay.
that's gonna have to be that's a policy decision.
Got it. And I saw it in your background, your second paragraph, you were talking about mechanisms to recover upfront
okay.
additional costs for new developments such as roadways, water, sewer line extensions, or improvements. That's where I kind of got the idea that this scope was going to include those items.
No, that was kind of just in general about impact fees. This
Okay.
scope itself is only roadways.
Got it.
Andy?
Good, thanks.
Just through my quick Google search on impact fees.
Sure.
It seems to be kind of a legal gray area in some places. Have you kind of explored the legal aspect of it?
No, and here we would use your legal team. I mean, we're gonna be based on case law and other things throughout Ohio. So, but in the final review, we would ask the city, since it is your program, to at least have the purview of your law director look at it. I have found with other projects, even if our legal team looks at it, opinions vary differently. And ultimately, the city would be enforcing this and implementing this, so I would want your legal team to have the final say, because if it's challenged, obviously we'll be there to support our findings, but your legal team would be the ones to defend it.
Okay.
I'll just say, hearing the feedback from the committee this evening, I feel like I need to have a discussion with Jim about amending the scope of this to include some, I'm thinking 3 or 4, just to build in here, development committee and council meetings, and with it being an hourly rate, if we don't need it, we wouldn't be billed for it.
Correct.
But I feel like that, hearing this is good to hear that, and the direction that we want to go with it. So I can work with Jim on that, knowing that that's probably going to push it over the threshold that will have to come back to council on August 5th for consideration.
Nothing else? Thank you for coming
No problem.
and going over this with us.
Thank you for your time.
Questions, and I'm sure that we'll have more in the future.
I'll be here. I'll get
We'll
with
be
you.
in touch.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Grab a water on your way out, Jim.
Is it warm?
All right, next item on the agenda, Scott.
Thank you. The next one is a proposed plan revision for the Sage Point subdivision. The current plan was tabled at the Planning and Zoning Commission on March 6th of this year. Before you on your dais, I received an updated plan for the proposed revision. That's the front page. And a concept of the existing plan is on the second page to give you a comparison. The original plan that was tabled at the Planning and Zoning Commission, the request is to rezone to a planned development district. The revised plan would have a rezoning to the R10 high-density residential district, which would follow the standards outlined in the code. The comprehensive plan does recommend R20 medium-density residential. And I think folks from Fisher and Connie Klima here to address this further.
So all of you got the larger size? If you need it, I have plenty. Okay, Fisher Homes, as you know, we just zoned here in Manor, and we're going through that process, and also had submitted for this site on Summit, and had met with superintendent of the schools numerous times, and also had done a lot of work. We made our application, and given some of the responses of council to sizes of lots with cluster designs, widths, mostly widths, we thought it might be a good idea, since we had it tabled at Planning Commission, to have a relook at this design. The second page is the design that is currently pending with the Planning Commission. And the first page of the design is where we forget the cluster design, and we go with more of a straight R10 type zoning with 75-foot lots instead of 52-foot wide lots. And keep in mind, this plan would have the same size house developed on the properties as with the cluster design. So it's mostly a design change in lot width. Now, if you look at the density on the revised plan, conceptual, it's 189 homes. On the cluster, it's 212. So there is the difference of 23 lots. Also, if you look at the conceptual, there's a lot more open space area because of the cluster. But, and we're not talking mostly about the school district, which we understand that that's not part of what we can count, but that's a 10-acre portion of the site on both, so that hasn't changed. So I thought it was a good idea, actually. We were going to take this concept to the planning commission and say, pause out for a while, look at this, but Scott thought it might be a good idea to have this time to talk with you, because as we know, it ultimately comes to you. And a lot of times I've learned this year that you don't know what all we've been thinking as we go through the planning commission. So we're trying to work with you to understand more and get some more feedback about what a developer is trying to figure out that's going to work for them to develop and work for you for approval. So that's why we're here tonight, to have more of a conversation than we can have when we're at council. So. And before we go to planning commission again.
Absolutely.
So-
I know personally, I like the fact that the lot size has increased to 75, because that's generally 75 is close to kind of the minimum of what I like to see as far as lot sizes. And we're trying to steer as much from the cluster as we can. So I do appreciate that revision, that update. So.
I think, Connie, that both you and the developers are at the disadvantage of the fact that council doesn't have one vision on what they're looking for. Because I know that my concerns are different than, I don't support 1 acre lots for every house. I don't have necessarily a lot size requirement. You could have a 1 acre lot and put a mobile home on it. It doesn't make, to me, the value anymore. My concern is more of the infrastructure and the area impact is what I'm really looking at. And while I definitely, we have a need for all ranges of housing in the city. I don't think saying, we want 1 acre lots with $350,000 homes on it is an okay thing to do. That's me personally. I think that there's a place for apartments and condominiums. Whether it's clustered or not isn't necessarily a concern of mine. I'm more concerned at where we're at as a city at the point in time when the development comes. And unfortunately, the city has just been behind in that, and for countless reasons, but we've never been proactive in making sure that we're set up in a way that we can support new things coming in without having a detriment that spills onto everything. The people who already live there, the police, the intersections, the water. It's just countless problems that we're trying to now, address. So when I see something like this, I definitely think there's a place for that on Summit. I like the development. I don't personally have a problem with the cluster. What I'm more concerned about is the timing and how long it takes us to improve that entire area for the people who already have to live there. Summit Road is a disaster, from flooding to the intersections, and the more people we put there, the more difficult it is to make those infrastructure improvements. You take down, we had a discussion about Havens Corners and Summit. When we finally get to the point we can fix that, we're actually gonna have to take that intersection completely out of commission for, it could be a year. It could take who knows how much time. And in the meantime, we're adding more houses into the area. So when I'm looking at the developments coming in, I am not, and this has been such a hot topic and gone round, it's not anti-development or houses, it's more, are we doing what's right now? And are we fairly letting developers know our expectations when they come in about, because, quite frankly, and I've said it before, the developer comes in and they develop and they're gone, and then we're left with the leftover problems that come from it. So I think that council has a responsibility to get on, at least, have a candid discussion about where people stand, that way developers know fairly where they're at when they're coming into the city and proposing things. I don't think that we've done that. That's just my opinion.
Scott, on this, the open space requirement under R10, do
Yes.
you know offhand what that is, requirement? Or
No,
Connie,
there's a
maybe,
park area based upon certain calculations. Offhand, I don't know.
do you know
Well,
if
if
this
it
meets
wasn't a
the,
PUD, I don't think that we have a,
there's not an R10 requirement for open, for?
There is
There
for,
is, and I believe that.
but, like, I think they're factoring that in with the top lot, but I have not had an opportunity.
I just
I
wondered
don't know
if,
what the acreage is.
okay, second question, Connie, do you know, to me, just in a real quick run on this, it looks like there's about twice as much infrastructure for the, I'm gonna call it the 75-foot lots.
Yes.
Is that accurate?
I don't know, percentage-wise, you being the engineers, you said, I don't know if that's accurate, but you're definitely correct, because now we have much more road footage and much more requirements for that, yes. Which
Okay.
is why the wider lots are difficult.
And the reason why I bring that up to the committee is just, it's a future cost. It's just called, when we have to go repave, or we have to crack seal, or we have to do anything. It's just a future cost. Third question I have for you, Connie.
You have 20% more infrastructure in that plan.
In the second,
In the R10 plan, you have 20% more infrastructure serving 23% fewer sites.
I understand, okay. As far as the lot, which you would sell a lot in the concept plan, 75-foot lot versus the 52-foot lot, where do you see the price differential there?
May I answer that then?
I mean, historically.
Yeah,
Historically, what we see is that, my name is Jason Wisniewski. I'm the Vice President of Planning and Zoning with Grand Communities. We are the affiliated development company of Fisher Homes. Tim Brader's here from Fisher Homes. So typically what we see is there a value add for what we call home site or lot width? Sure, there is some. Is it enough to make up that difference of 20%? No, historically we don't see that. And one thing that I would also caution here is, just to kind of weigh the pros and cons, in the R10 plan you have what we lovingly call social lots, so you will always, you have a neighbor behind you, right? Your lot abuts somebody else's lot. However, in the cluster plan, you have a dedicated open or park space, so that there's some trade-off in value. Yes, I have a wider site, but you're gonna end up with sites in that cluster plan that are more valuable because I know I'm never gonna have something behind me. So.
Well, that brings up a follow-up question to that is, and I noticed in the cluster plan, you have a lot of green space.
Yeah.
We don't know what that is necessarily. Is it dedicated park to the city? Is it a reserve that an association runs? Because that's important also. We have parks that we try to take our best care of. We don't necessarily take the best care of because it's just financially difficult. So adding more parks might not be a bonus to the city, while it may be beneficial to, lot number 155.
Right.
What would you envision, so that we understand all the differences here, what would you envision the park or the green space in either plan be?
So typically our default as a home builder, developer, is that those open spaces are going to be owned and maintained by an HOA that we will set up. So we always set up an HOA in our communities. The residents, the 212 residents will pay for that open space, and that will be rolled into their, it'll be calculated what it's gonna do, how it's gonna be maintained, and then that fee is given to a homeowner when they purchase the home. In either scenario. We are always open to conversations with municipalities or other entities to say, hey, we want to own that open space, or we'll take that because we own, we get in these conversations all the time. We have conservation groups that own land adjacent. Well, we'd like that land, can you dedicate it to us, can you sell it to us? So those conversations are always open. Our default though is it's gonna be owned and operated by an HOA.
Okay, thank you. I could give you my opinion if you want. Mel, I appreciate your opinion on this, and I think that both of them are, your opinion is very valid. The different places have different things that make sense. Here I see, large stands of trees. I see a good reason to maybe cluster in some of these areas. It looks like it's well thought out as far as circulation. Whereas the standard, I'm gonna call it the standard R10, it's just that. It's just standard. I know there's a lot of thought put in, some thought put into it, but it's just a standard layout. That's all it is to it. It's a maximizing layout.
Okay.
That's how I that's how I see it. I don't know which one's more valuable, quite frankly. I know which one I'd rather live in, but that's not necessarily what's best for the city. So I'm trying to throw out some other ideas of I don't know, maybe things to value. Not necessarily, not talking to the developer necessarily, but saying these are the things the city could value or put into a checklist of what do we want. And less infrastructure, I think, is definitely one of those that we want, in general, in my opinion.
Another matter that we took into great consideration in regard to what you just said is there's a lot of stormwater problems on this site, have been for years. It's been a problem in this particular area in the development across the street. So what my client has done is they've met with your engineers and also have reviewed the issues. And they found that the sizing of the ponds and everything on the development across the street were not done adequately, and it presumed some stormwater is not coming from where they are. So that was one of the big things that we presented to the planning commission, was that they are going to come in and working with Alan and others, your other engineers, Hall, they're going to be addressing and correcting existing problems with stormwater, which is a huge thing, so, and expensive. So there are a lot of infrastructure issues with this site that we've had to address to even get to the place we are now with the planning commission. So I don't have all those details, but those details are of record, and we'll be presenting those again to the planning commission.
I would say, as we're talking about, you mentioned a checklist.
Not
Well-
necessarily. In my head, it's a checklist.
That's, and I like that idea, because as I'm looking at these and I look at the cluster, one of the things that jumps out to me is compared to the new proposal, the cluster offers an opportunity for future roadway connections and extensions, whereas the cluster really doesn't lend itself to that, if there's any value in that or not. Also, as we're talking about this, and it kind of goes back to our impact fee statement, you asked about, what is success, how would you gauge success with impact fees, and I know implementation and adoption and implementation is a big one, but I think, as to Mel's point, it made me think of it, as we're talking about these, how you would gauge success is, are we creating an environment by improving our infrastructure that we're able to support this growth that is coming to the community?
That's a good success measure.
Well, and just to add, because I've thought, obviously, not that you guys haven't, but I've thought a lot about this, and we run into the same thing when it comes to property maintenance codes, which is why we don't have one. It's like all taboo. You don't say property maintenance code even, because we're so different in different areas of the city that it's not a one size fits all. So we can't just say to a developer, this is what we want, because it doesn't fit in different spots. I know I have a concern for the people who already live in this area, and pricing them out of the homes that they're in now, and having things coming around them. So there's just so many different concerns based on where we're developing. And obviously that's my stomping ground, so see it every day, and that road is a nightmare.
You're talking about Summit?
Yeah, I hate traveling Summit. You never know if you're going to make it there in 5 minutes or 15 minutes, based on what might be happening, because it's not wide enough to pass an accident. you can't pull off to the side of the road if there is something, you can't, I mean, you're just stuck. There's not a lot of options, and so when we add a whole nother development, that concerns me. Now, the infrastructure improvement to the water and the drainage issues is, I mean, that's huge, because that's obviously something we talk about all the time, and just north of that, on Haloon, and there is a huge drainage problem that's, I mean, we're talking about a 6-year plan in phases to try to fix it because it's so expensive.
Sure.
So, I mean, those are definitely benefits. So that's where we come with, you know, it's not a checklist necessarily, but I mean, it can't be a one-size-fits-all either. But on this particular site, I am not opposed to the cluster design. I'm not.
Well, that's good feedback, and, we'll see where we can go from here.
BJ?
Scott, this is currently tabled at planning commission,
That's correct.
and which design is tabled?
The cluster design.
Does anybody else have any comments? Thank you.
Alright, our last item on the agenda, we're gonna start, just get into a brief discussion, kinda maybe get this train going to talk about maybe some design standards when it comes to developments and all that kind of stuff. Scott, you wanna kinda talk about that a little bit?
Sure, so, when there was mention of design standards, I went back to ones I was most familiar with, because I worked at Pickerington for a little while. And on the attached sheet, this is kind of their new house checklist, to make sure everything is supplied on the plan. We have adopted a version of this, just because it makes it easier for both the developer preparing the site plan and us in review, that we all have the same checklist, we all know what's expected, and it's easier to submit, it's easier to review. At some point prior to my tenure with the city of Pickerington, they crafted some design standards, and I'm sure there's some communities that have much more specific design standards, and these are generally basic. But if you look at the elevations portion of the checklist, talks about 50% of the front elevation being natural materials, minimum siding thickness, windows, dimensional shingles on the roof, chimneys, exterior trim, roof pitch, etc. So those are some relatively basic ones that were implemented in the city of Pickerington. I'm sure we could find more that are much more involved, but this was kind of a jumping off point for discussion this evening.
Now, do we have some design standards in place currently for?
We do not have any
Done
design
for
standards in
houses.
terms of how a house is built, the materials, et cetera. I mean, there's building standards that they must meet building code, but for us, there's no standard. So typically, if there are standards implemented, that would be through a plan district and in the development text where those are required. However, per our code, there's nothing specific that would address these items.
Okay. Either of you have any thoughts on what you said?
Sure. I've had some experience with design standards, not only in New Albany, but in Pickerington. I can tell you Pickerington was, it was a flashpoint for Pickerington. 8-inch soffits were, people were willing to, commit area carryover. Because it takes certain builders out of the area. Miranda, for instance. Miranda would not be able to meet these standards.
If I may, they were building under these standards in Pickerington.
They have built in these, okay, so then they modified something because they weren't. That was one of the issues that came up, was this was a way to arbitrarily choose who could build and who couldn't. Miranda has a package, they build their house off-site, bring it, and it's an erector set type of thing. So anyhow, so it does do that, which is sometimes not all bad. But it does take your lower price points out of the market. And as I think we've talked about, those are not a bad thing to have, you know, throughout the city in certain areas and in certain developments and in certain numbers. But if you, this is an absolute, so this makes it so that it isn't going to happen. That's a downside, I guess. Upside is, you know, if you travel through Biggerton and a lot of the new subdivisions, they're very nice. They're very nicely done, and they're usually of a higher price. And whether they're on a small lot or on a big lot, they still meet these standards, which is good for an area that's developing quickly. It also gives the developer notice, here's what you're going to do, or here's what the minimum we expect. So I think this might actually help with some of the development discussion in general.
Oh, Scott, I don't know if you looked at any other city municipalities, if they have design standards or looked at them, and I guess this compared to that, other ones, how rigid is this? How, you know, what's it, is this more, you said other ones have more specific design standards, other cities have more specific design standards. So I'm just trying to figure out, like, where does this one fall? And, like, are these pretty loose compared to other places, or?
And I did not have an opportunity to look at other communities, but based upon an educated guess, I can assume some probably are much more rigid than these. From my experience from other ones I've seen, these are somewhat on the low end. It's relatively basic, so it's not
Okay.
as rigorous as others could be.
I would tell you that the one up in New Albany is 5 or 6 pages, and it goes down to the size of the brick that you're gonna use. So, I mean, they can get that much detail. Dublin's the same. Dublin is very detailed.
Those are
not
my two
surprising.
guesses.
Those are the two.
And they're very, there's a militia that takes care of it. They make sure that they are built that way, period. That's another downside, that's another side to this too, is that, there's a whole unit of government that takes care of it there.
Right.
So that's another, either you can consider an upside or a downside. This takes people to implement. And I don't know if you've looked at that at all, Scott, what would it take to implement a design standard? To go out and check it, to verify that they're doing it, to, when the plans come in, to review it. I know in New Albany, they call it an ARC, Architectural Review Board.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I jumped in front of you there, Mel, I didn't mean to ask that question, but how do you do that in Pataskala?
If design standards were to be implemented here, we would add them, as I mentioned, we have a similar checklist, we would add all these items to the checklist. And on the plan submitted, we would go through and check everything off. And then when the zoning inspector goes out for the certificate of compliance, he would have these to be sure that he looks for. Right now, you know, sod, landscaping package, some of those types of things are on there. He looks for those when he does certificate of compliance. We would just add those to the list so there'd be additional criteria in order to get the certificate of compliance. Certain things of subsiding, we could have that on the plan. That would require Steve to go out before the siding goes on. You have to go and measure it, then come back. So I think there could be some that would be more laborious than others, but, you know, looking at, for example, the 50% natural material on the front. If you go and that's stone, you meet the requirement, but some, the subsiding, some of those could be a bit more involved.
I guess, for myself and not having experience with, you know, even beginning to be able to compare a design standard, cause I have no idea what a lot of those things look like, right? It would be helpful for me if there was some examples. So, if we had even, because you have nothing else to do, a small packet of stuff, that showed me something that was, like a Pickering tin. And, you know, even if it's the mock-up, like, you know, a little drawing that shows a house with the design standards, if that's what would fit those check marks. And then you would have the New Albany one, like if we had one on the extreme end down to, you know, with some cities around us that are comparable to us, would be helpful for me to visualize what we're actually talking about. Because it's difficult for me to make a decision on things like this when I have no idea how to compare it to
That makes
something
sense.
else.
That makes
So-
sense. So what I can do is I'll look into Pickerington, maybe get a site or a elevation plan from them showing the criteria depicted upon that. I can talk to New Albany and say, do you have one that shows your criteria, and see, arguably, if we can find someone in between, just to give the full range of the different standards.
Upper Arlington has one that's pretty
Well, and
well done. I would say well done. It explains out in pretty good detail.
Well, and you know, if a company, it was like one of the little drawings that shows the house,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that said this would be what the 18-foot driveway looks like versus, you know, and this is whatever it is that they're requiring. Just to kind of give us, again, because we're not a one-size-fits-all.
Right.
And so, I don't think that we can make some extreme demands for every place in the city. So we're gonna have to come up with something that, I mean, we don't wanna get too complicated and say if you're building in a certain area, it's done this way. But I mean, I don't know, if you're on an acre lot, you have to have this, but if you're doing this, it has to be that. I don't know. Does it get that
It's a
detailed?
great point. Well, to a degree, yes. But it's a great point if you're on a 10-acre lot versus a subdivision lot. You know, are we
Right.
gonna apply the standards equally and the same?
Right.
I think that would be odd to do that. There's also a renovation standard. You know, New Albany gets to the point where they go with wood-clad windows. And they are telling you exactly what is going to be in the whole build package. And I don't know that we would ever want to do that, period.
Mm-hmm.
But it does matter quite a bit
Absolutely.
what you're next to and where, you know, what size lot you're gonna have.
Well, I just wanna make sure that, that we are thorough enough that we don't, set the future generations of council up for problems or failure when we put something together now. Because I know that things were done in the past where it looked like a wonderful idea when they were working on it, and we don't realize until sometimes a decade or so later that presents a huge problem for us.
Mm-hmm.
And so we deal with the mistakes or, you know, the unknowns of past decisions.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanna be as thorough as possible.
I think also just trying to find a place that, or develop some kind of design standard that isn't so burdensome that drives away developers, and it's way too much. It drives up the housing costs, and also design standards that aren't enough. That it's like there just wasn't really any point in implementing these because they're not,
Exactly.
because they don't achieve the
The goal.
goal, right?
Absolutely.
So I think, just finding some other cities who've implemented design standards, maybe some examples of those design standards, so we
Mhm.
can compare those and actually see visually what that looks like.
Okay, I'll look into that.
Thanks, Rob.
And
I would just add, I think this is a good starting point. I don't see anything out in this that jumps out that's just overly prohibitive to anyone. You know, there might be some goofy stuff, you know, the pinning of a lot when it's next to a setback. And that might be a little bit, you might wanna look at that as an idea if you have to do that or you don't have to do it. But, yeah, I don't see anything on here that's crazy.
I agree that this seems like a good foundation for establishing these, and this is good feedback from the committee, indicating that this is something you're interested in learning more about, looking at options.
Is that an engineer term, goofy?
I could say something else, but goofy is a good word. I might have to give you that one.
Alright, do you have anything else for design standard?
No.
Alright, do we have anything else needs to be addressed?
No, sir.
Alright, well, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Second,
Powell,
Yes.
Carter,
Yes.
Walter,
yes.
Every time we talk about something, I just.